What if I told you that the most delicious plate of com tam you ever had held a secret so dark, so horrifying, it would curdle your blood and haunt your nightmares? What if the secret ingredient in that savory grilled pork, that perfectly steamed egg meatloaf, was something, or someone, you knew? It sounds like the plot of a horror movie, doesn't it? But for the unsuspecting residents of this bustling city, it became a terrifying reality. Before we delve into the shadows and uncover the chilling case of the broken rice shop that secretly served human flesh, do me a favor. If you enjoy stories that explore the darkest corners of the human psyche, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single detail of this shocking investigation. Our story begins on a humid Saigon evening, where the aroma of grilled meat and fragrant rice usually brought comfort to weary souls. But soon, that familiar scent would forever be tainted by a gruesome truth. The alleyway where Com Tam on High resided was a microcosm of Saigon itself, a chaotic yet harmonious symphony of life. The narrow lane, barely wide enough for two motorbikes to pass, was perpetually slick with a thin film of grease and discarded dishwater. The air, thick and humid, was a heady concoction of sizzling pork, fermenting garbage, fragrant herbs, and the ever-present exhaust fumes of a city that never slept. It was a place where secrets could fester, where the anonymity of the crowd was a shield for both the innocent and the depraved. And at the heart of this vibrant artery, nestled between a dingy mobile phone repair shop and a family-run convenience store, was On High's Broken Rice Eatery. From the outside, it was utterly unremarkable. A simple, open-fronted establishment with a handful of stainless steel tables and matching stools that spilled out onto the pavement. A large, glass-fronted cabinet displayed the day's offerings. Glistening slabs of swan nuong, grilled pork chops, marinated in a dark, mysterious sauce. Cha trung hap, steamed egg and pork meatloaf, with its distinctive golden brown surface. And B, a delicate mixture of shredded pork and pork skin, tossed in toasted rice powder. A massive, charcoal-fired grill, manned by a perpetually sweating, taciturn man, hissed and spat, sending plumes of savory smoke into the already saturated air. The proprietor, a man known only as Mr. Vin, was as unassuming as his establishment. He was a man in his late 50s, with a slight stoop and a face that seemed permanently etched with a look of mild melancholy. His hands, though, were a contradiction to his otherwise frail appearance. They were large, calloused, and surprisingly strong, capable of cleaving through a rack of ribs with a single, fluid motion. He rarely spoke, communicating mostly through a series of grunts and nods. Yet, there was an undeniable artistry to his work. The way he fanned the charcoal to the perfect temperature, the precise timing with which he flipped the pork chops, the almost reverent manner in which he assembled each plate of com tam, it was a performance that drew in a steady stream of customers, from hungry office workers to weary cyclo-drivers. And the food was sublime. The broken rice, a cheaper grade of rice fractured during the milling process, was cooked to fluffy perfection. The pork chops were a masterpiece of culinary alchemy, charred and crispy on the outside, yet unbelievably tender and succulent within. The marinade, a closely guarded secret, was a complex symphony of flavors. Sweet, savory, smoky, with an undercurrent of something else, something indefinable that lingered on the palate and kept people coming back for more. It was this something else that made Com Tam on High a local legend. People would whisper about it, trying to deconstruct the enigmatic flavor. Was it a spice, a special kind of soy sauce, or perhaps a unique cut of meat? Whatever it was addictive. Among the regulars was a young woman named Lynn, a 22-year-old university student. She lived in a small, rented room just a few blocks away. For Lynn, Com Tam on High was more than just a place to eat. It was a small, affordable comfort in a life that was often overwhelming. She would come here almost every evening, her textbooks and notebooks spread out on the small, wobbly table, finding a strange sense of solace in the rhythmic clatter of the cleaver and the sizzle of the grill. One sweltering Tuesday evening, as Lynn was struggling with a particularly dense chapter on contract law, she noticed a new face at the shop. It was a young man, probably a few years older than her, with a kind smile and a mop of unruly black hair. He was a XEOM, motorbike taxi, driver, his green grab jacket draped over the back of his chair. He caught her eye and offered a shy, almost apologetic smile. Over the next few days, they fell into a comfortable routine, exchanging small talk and sharing glances over their plates of broken rice. His name was Tuan, and like Lin, he was a transplant to the city, trying to carve out a life for himself. Their budding friendship was a small, bright spot in Lin's otherwise monotonous life. They talked about their dreams, their families back in the countryside, their shared feeling of being small fish in a vast, indifferent ocean. Tuan would often wait for her to finish her studies, offering her a free ride back to her apartment, a small act of kindness that she cherished. It was during one of these late-night conversations that Lin first noticed something odd. Tuan, a man with a hearty appetite, had suddenly become a picky eater. He would push the pork chop around his plate, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Is something wrong?" Lin had asked, her fork halfway to her mouth. "I don't know," Tuan had replied, his voice barely a whisper. "The pork tastes different." Lin had taken a bite of her own pork chop. It was, as always, delicious. The smoky char, the tender meat, the intoxicating marinade, it was perfection. "It tastes fine to me," she had said, a little defensively. Tuan had shaken his head. "No, it's not the same. It has a strange aftertaste, almost metallic." Lin had dismissed it as a figment of his imagination, perhaps a result of his long, tiring day. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few days, she started paying closer attention. She noticed that the taciturn man at the grill, who she had always assumed was just an employee, seemed to have an almost symbiotic relationship with Mr. Vin. They would communicate with a series of subtle gestures and glances, a silent language that excluded everyone else. She also noticed the strange hours Mr. Vin kept. The shop would close around 10 p.m., but she would often see a faint light in the back long into the early hours of the morning. And then there were the deliveries, large, unmarked vans that would arrive in the dead of night, their contents shrouded in secrecy. Her unease grew when Tuan suddenly disappeared. One evening, he simply wasn't there. His usual table was occupied by a boisterous group of construction workers. Lin waited, expecting him to show up late, but he never did. The next day, she went to the spot where he usually parked his motorbike, but there was no sign of him. She asked the other XEOM drivers, but they just shrugged, their faces a mixture of indifference and mild concern. People disappeared in Saigon all the time. It was a city that swallowed people whole, leaving no trace behind. But Lin couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Tuan's last words to her echoed in her mind. "The pork tastes different." She started to lose her appetite for Comtam on high. The once comforting aroma now seemed cloying, almost sickening. She would walk past the shop, her heart pounding in her chest, a strange primal fear gripping her. It was a few weeks after Tuan's disappearance that the first official missing person report was filed. A young man, a recent migrant from the countryside who worked at a nearby factory, had vanished without a trace. His family, frantic with worry, had plastered the neighborhood with posters bearing his smiling, hopeful face. The police launched a perfunctory investigation, but in a city of millions, a single missing person was barely a ripple in the vast ocean of humanity. Then, another person went missing, and another. The victims seemed to have no connection to each other, apart from one small, seemingly insignificant detail. They were all regulars at Comtam on high. The disappearances were subtle at first, easily dismissed as the random, unfortunate events that were an inevitable part of life in a sprawling metropolis. But as the number of missing people grew, a quiet, insidious fear began to creep into the heart of the community. The posters of smiling faces, once a symbol of hope, now served as a grim reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of their everyday lives. Lin, consumed by a mixture of guilt and fear, started her own amateur investigation. She would sit at a cafe across the street from Comtam on high, watching, waiting for something, anything that would confirm her growing suspicions. She saw the same unmarked vans arriving in the dead of night. She saw Mr. Vin and his silent assistant hauling large, heavy sacks into the back of the shop. And then, one night, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was late, well past midnight. The alley was deserted, save for a few stray cats rummaging through a pile of garbage. Mr. Vin and his assistant were loading something into the back of the van. It was a long, cylindrical object, wrapped in a thick, black plastic sheet. As they lifted it, the plastic snagged on a sharp corner of the van, tearing a small hole. For a fleeting moment, under the dim, flickering light of a street lamp, Lynn saw what was inside. It was a human hand. The world around her seemed to tilt on its axis. The sounds of the city faded into a dull roar, replaced by the frantic thumping of her own heart. She wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, anyone, what she had seen. But she was paralyzed by a fear so profound, so visceral, that it stole the air from her lungs. She stumbled back into the shadows, her mind reeling. The horrific image of the severed hand burned into her memory. The next day, she went to the police. She was a trembling, incoherent mess, her story a jumble of fragmented sentences and half-formed accusations. The officer on duty, a world-weary man with a face like a crumpled piece of paper, listened with a mixture of pity and skepticism. A severed hand? In the back of a broken rice shop? It sounded like something out of a cheap horror movie. He took her statement, promised to look into it, and then promptly filed it away, dismissing it as the ramblings of a hysterical, grief-stricken young woman. But Lynn's report, however unbelievable it seemed, had planted a seed. It had landed on the desk of a man who was not so easily swayed by skepticism. A man who had seen enough of the city's underbelly to know that the most monstrous truths often hid behind the most mundane facades. His name was Detective Min, and he was about to be drawn into a case that would not only test the limits of his own sanity, but would also expose a level of depravity that would shock the entire nation. The fragrant aroma of deceit that emanated from Comtam on high was about to be replaced by the stench of death, and the dark secret that lay hidden in its kitchen was about to be dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light. The city of Saigon was about to lose its appetite. Detective Min was a man who wore the city of Saigon like a second skin. Its grit was permanently embedded under his fingernails. Its relentless humidity was a constant companion, and its cacophony of sounds was the soundtrack to his life. He was a homicide detective, a profession that had stripped him of any romantic notions he might have once had about human nature. He had seen the very worst that people were capable of, the casual cruelty and the calculated malevolence that thrived in the shadows of the city's gleaming skyscrapers. Yet, for all his cynicism, he possessed an unwavering belief in a simple, almost archaic concept: the truth. And it was this relentless pursuit of the truth that had made him one of the most respected and feared detectives in the department. When Lynn's report landed on his desk, his initial reaction was one of weary resignation. It was the kind of wild, unsubstantiated claim that usually ended up being a dead end, a product of an overactive imagination or a personal vendetta. But something about it, the sheer, unadulterated terror in the young woman's written statement, nagged at him. He pulled up the recent missing persons reports for the district, a grim litany of lost souls. As he cross-referenced the names and addresses, a pattern began to emerge, a faint, almost imperceptible thread connecting the disparate lives. They were all young, all relatively new to the city, and they had all frequented the same small, unassuming broken rice shop, Comtam on High. Min decided to pay the shop a visit. He went in the late afternoon, during the lull between the lunch and dinner rushes. The place was almost empty, save for a couple of elderly men nursing their iced coffees. The air was thick with the lingering aroma of grilled pork, a smell that would have once made his mouth water but now carried a faint, unsettling undertone. Mr. Vin was behind the counter, meticulously cleaning his cleaver. He looked up as Min approached, his eyes, small and dark, betraying no emotion. Min introduced himself, flashing his badge. Mr. Vin simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I have a few questions for you," Min said, his voice calm and even. I'm a busy man, Mr. Vin replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. I'm sure you are, Min said, a hint of steel in his tone. But I'm sure you'd rather answer my questions here than down at the station. A flicker of something, perhaps annoyance, perhaps fear, crossed Mr. Vin's face before it was quickly suppressed. He gestured towards one of the stainless steel tables. Min's interrogation was a masterclass in subtlety. He didn't ask about the disappearances, not directly. Instead, he talked about the neighborhood, the rising crime rate, the challenges of running a small business in a city that was constantly changing. He was building a rapport, lulling Mr. Vin into a false sense of security. But for all his efforts, Mr. Vin remained an impenetrable fortress. His answers were short, non-committal, his face a mask of weary indifference. As Min was about to leave, his eyes fell upon the taciturn man at the grill. The man hadn't said a word the entire time, his focus solely on the glowing embers of the charcoal. There was something about him, a coiled, latent energy that set Min's teeth on edge. Who's your friend? Min asked, nodding towards the man. He's my nephew, Mr. Vin said, a little too quickly. He helps me out. What's his name? Bao. Min made a mental note of the name. As he left the shop, the savory aroma of the grilling pork followed him out into the street. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just scratched the surface of something deeply, profoundly wrong. He decided to put a tail on Mr. Vin. It was a long shot, a drain on the department's already stretched resources, but his gut told him it was the right move. For the next few days, a team of undercover officers watched ComTam on high, documenting every delivery, every late-night visitor, every deviation from the mundane routine of a typical street food vendor. The first break in the case came from the most unlikely of sources, a disgruntled former employee. A young man named Hung had worked at the shop for a few months before being unceremoniously fired. He had been caught stealing from the till, a petty crime that had earned him a swift and brutal beating from Bao. Hung, nursing a grudge and a set of bruised ribs, was more than happy to talk to the police. His story painted a chilling picture of life behind the scenes at ComTam on high. He spoke of Mr. Vin's volatile temper, of Bao's silent, menacing presence, and of the strange, secretive nature of their operations. He confirmed Lin's account of the late-night deliveries, adding a gruesome detail. The sacks that were brought in were often leaking a dark, viscous fluid that smelled vaguely of iron. He also spoke of a locked room in the back of the shop, a room that he had been strictly forbidden from entering. He had once caught a glimpse inside when the door was left ajar. He had seen a large, industrial-grade meat grinder and a collection of knives and saws that were far more suited to a butcher's shop than a small eatery. Armed with this new information, Min knew he had enough to get a warrant. But he also knew that he needed to tread carefully. Mr. Vin and Bao were not common criminals. They were organized, meticulous, and, he suspected, utterly ruthless. A direct assault on their fortress would be a risky and potentially deadly endeavor. He decided to set a trap. He had one of his officers, a young, fresh-faced rookie, go undercover as a down-on-his-luck migrant worker, the perfect prey for the predators he was hunting. The officer, whose name was Qian, spent a week frequenting the shop, building a rapport with Mr. Vin, playing the part of a lonely, desperate young man looking for a connection in a cold, unforgiving city. The bait was taken. One evening, as Qian was finishing his meal, Mr. Vin approached him, his face a mask of fatherly concern. He offered Qian a job, a place to stay, a chance to get back on his feet. It was a tempting offer, a lifeline for a man who was pretending to be drowning. Qian accepted, and as he was led towards the back of the shop, towards the locked room that Hung had spoken of, he activated the small, concealed listening device that was pinned to his shirt. The team, parked in an unmarked van just down the street, listened with bated breath as the drama unfolded. They heard the sound of a heavy door being unlocked, the faint, almost imperceptible hum of a large piece of machinery. They heard Mr. Vin's voice, no longer the gravelly rasp of a weary shopkeeper, but a cold, predatory hiss. "You're a long way from home, aren't you, boy?" Mr. Vin's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Yes, sir," Ken replied, his voice steady, betraying no sign of the fear that was undoubtedly coursing through his veins. "Don't worry," Mr. Vin said, a chilling, almost paternal tone to his voice. "You're safe here. We'll take good care of you." Then, they heard another sound, a sound that made their blood run cold. The sharp metallic clang of a cleaver being picked up from a stainless steel table. That was the signal. The raid was swift and brutal. A team of heavily armed officers stormed the shop, their shouts echoing through the narrow alleyway. They found Bao in the main dining area, a stunned, almost comical look of surprise on his face. He was subdued before he had a chance to react. Min led a second team to the back. They kicked down the door to the locked room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The scene that greeted them was a tableau of pure, unadulterated horror. The room was a makeshift abattoir. The walls were splattered with dried blood. The floor was slick with a gruesome cocktail of gore and bodily fluids. A large, industrial-grade meat grinder, stained with a dark, reddish-brown substance, stood in the center of the room. Hooks, the kind used for hanging sides of beef, dangled from the ceiling. And on a large, stainless steel table, lay the dismembered remains of a human body. Mr. Vin was standing over the table, a blood-soaked cleaver in his hand. He looked up as the officers burst in, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He let out a guttural roar and lunged at Min, the cleaver raised high. A single shot rang out, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Mr. Vin stumbled back, a look of surprise on his face, a small, dark hole blossoming in the center of his chest. He collapsed to the floor, the cleaver clattering to the ground beside him. As the paramedics attended to Qian, who had managed to escape with only a few minor cuts, Min surveyed the scene, a wave of nausea washing over him. The stench of death was overwhelming, a cloying, metallic smell that clung to the back of his throat. He had seen his fair share of gruesome crime scenes, but this was different. This was not a crime of passion, a fleeting moment of madness. This was a cold, calculated, and horrifically efficient operation. The forensic team worked through the night, meticulously documenting every piece of evidence. They found traces of human DNA in the meat grinder, in the marinade, and on the grilled pork chops that were ready to be served to the unsuspecting public. They found the personal belongings of the missing people, their clothes, their wallets, their phones, tucked away in a small, hidden compartment under the floorboards. The truth, when it was finally pieced together, was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Mr. Vin and Bao had been preying on the city's most vulnerable, the lonely, the desperate, the people who were so far from home that their disappearances would barely register as a blip on the city's radar. They would lure them in with a promise of food, of work, of a place to belong, and then, when their guard was down, they would butcher them like animals, their flesh served up to the very community they had sought to become a part of. The secret ingredient in the famous Comtam on high, the something else that had kept people coming back for more, was human flesh. The stench of truth was the stench of death, and it was a smell that would haunt Detective Min and the city of Saigon for a very long time. The revelation of what had transpired within the unassuming walls of Comtam on high sent a shockwave of horror and revulsion through Saigon. The story spread like wildfire, fueled by a morbid cocktail of fascination and fear. News outlets, both local and international, descended upon the small alleyway, their cameras and microphones transforming the once vibrant community into a macabre tourist attraction. The shop itself, now a sealed-off crime scene, became a grim monument to the depravity that had been hiding in plain sight. People would come from all over the city to stare at its shuttered facade, their faces a mixture of disbelief and morbid curiosity. For Detective Min, the days that followed the raid were a blur of paperwork, press conferences, and endless, soul-crushing interviews with the families of the victims. He had to sit across from grieving parents, from heartbroken siblings, from devastated friends, and tell them the unimaginable truth about what had happened to their loved ones. He had to watch as their hope crumbled into despair, as their grief curdled into a rage that had no outlet. It was a burden that he carried with him long after he had left the sterile confines of the interrogation room. The investigation into the full extent of Mr. Vinh and Bao's crimes was a descent into the very heart of darkness. The forensic team, using DNA analysis, was able to identify the remains of over a dozen individuals. But they all knew that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The sheer volume of human remains found in the shop, the industrial scale of the operation, suggested that the number of victims was likely much higher. Bao, now in custody, had transformed from a silent, menacing presence into a broken, whimpering shell of a man. The facade of invincibility had been stripped away, revealing a pathetic, small-minded creature who was now facing the full weight of his horrific actions. Under interrogation, he confessed to everything. His story a chilling, matter-of-fact account of the unspeakable acts he and his uncle had committed. He spoke of a childhood marked by poverty and abuse, of a deep-seated resentment towards a world that he felt had cast him aside. He claimed that Mr. Vinh, a man who had taken him in when he had nowhere else to go, had been the mastermind behind the entire operation. It was Mr. Vinh, he said, who had first come up with the idea, who had perfected the gruesome art of turning human flesh into a culinary delicacy. Bao, a loyal and easily manipulated follower, had simply done as he was told. His confession, though detailed, was a transparent attempt to shift the blame, to paint himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. But there was no denying the cold, hard evidence. The forensic team found his fingerprints all over the murder weapons, his DNA mixed with that of the victims. He was as guilty as his uncle, a willing participant in a symphony of slaughter. As the trial approached, the city was gripped by a mixture of anticipation and dread. The case had become a national obsession, a grim cautionary tale about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary of lives. The courtroom was packed every day, the overflow crowds spilling out into the streets, their faces a sea of grim, expectant faces. Lin, the young woman whose initial report had been dismissed as the ramblings of a hysterical mind, was the prosecution's star witness. As she took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. Her voice, though trembling, was clear and steady as she recounted the events that had led her to the police station. She spoke of her friendship with Tuan, of his strange, unsettling comments about the taste of the pork, of the horrifying image of the severed hand that had been burned into her memory. Her testimony was a powerful and deeply personal account of the human cost of Mr. Vinh and Bao's crimes. The trial was a long and arduous process, a legal and emotional marathon that took its toll on everyone involved. But in the end, the verdict was never in doubt. Bao was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death, a punishment that was met with a mixture of solemn satisfaction and grim finality. For Detective Min, the verdict was not a cause for celebration. It was a somber, necessary conclusion to a case that had dragged him to the very edge of his own humanity. He had brought the killers to justice, but he knew that the scars of their crimes would linger for a long time. The families of the victims would never be whole again. The community, once a vibrant and close-knit tapestry of life, had been torn apart by fear and suspicion, and the city of Saigon, a city that he loved with a fierce, protective passion, had lost a piece of its innocence. In the months that followed the trial, the alleyway where Com Tam on High had once stood began to slowly heal. The shop itself was eventually torn down, replaced by a small, community garden, a place of life and renewal where there had once been only death and decay. The other businesses in the alley, which had suffered in the wake of the horrific revelations, began to see their customers return. The sounds of laughter and chatter once again filled the air, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But the memory of what had happened, the aftertaste of a justice that had come at a terrible price, remained. It was a ghost that haunted the alleyway, a shadow that fell upon the city's conscience. And for Detective Min, it was a constant reminder of the darkness that he had confronted, the darkness that he knew was always lurking, just beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to feast on the unsuspecting. He would continue to walk the city's streets, to fight for the truth, to be a guardian against the night. But he would do so with the knowledge that some horrors, once unleashed, can never be truly vanquished, their memory forever tainting the flavor of a city's soul. The case of the broken rice shop that secretly served human flesh was closed, but the questions it had raised about the nature of good and evil, of trust and betrayal, would continue to echo in the heart of Saigon, a chilling and unforgettable aftertaste.